pinpointing the problem. Now, if you're sick and you go to a doctor, you're hoping they'll be able to make a diagnosis. And once a diagnosis is made, there's either an options of treatments, or you're told there's no specific treatment. If your car breaks down and you don't have the skills to fix it yourself, and obviously it's almost impossible in the 21st century with the computerised nature of new cars, you take it to a mechanic or an auto electrician. They look at the problem, make a diagnosis, and then either you fix the car or you deregister it and scrap it. It's the same with society. We all are part of society, whether we like it or not. Even if people live off the grid in isolated rural areas, they are still part of a wider society. Now, we live on a continent surrounded by a number of islands, one of the 5 continents on planet Earth. And of the 8 billion plus people on the planet, only 28 million live on this resource-rich continent. That's a minuscule amount of the world's population. Now, some people tell you that this is a old continent, that it can't support a lot of people. The facts are a little bit different. 100,000 farmers in Australia provide food for 100 million people. We're also told consistently that we are one of the most progressive, egalitarian communities in the world. But when you look around you and you realise there are over 32,000 charities registered in this, 32,000, that's correct, charities registered in this country, and you look around you, you can see that though it's only 28 million people living on a resource-rich continent, we have extraordinary problems. Not the same problems, obviously, as people in Gaza or Sudan or any other place which is involved, or the Ukraine. But we do have problems in terms of not wealth creation, but wealth distribution. And that's pinpointing the problem we have. We create wealth for the rest of the world. We are in a position where we're major exporters of an extraordinary array of mineral resources. We export food to the rest of the world, but 3 million Australians, that's right, 3 million Australians, which is around 10%, suffer food insecurity. A fact. That's a fact. Then we have another 9 million Australians living a hand-to-mouth existence on social security benefits. That's a fact. And then we have the great bulk of the population being involved in work of some type or another, spending all their lives trying to pay bills to keep a roof over their heads, educate their children, keep food on the table, and possibly have a holiday or two. So we do have issues. But the issues aren't wealth creation. We create wealth as a nation. The issue is wealth distribution. So why don't we have mechanisms in place to ensure that wealth is distributed in a more equitable fashion? Not equally, but a more equitable fashion, so significant sections of the population don't have to suffer. Now, I know you've heard this a million times, and I'll say it again. When you have a private charity raising money to send Australian children to Australian publicly schools which are publicly funded, you know the nation as a problem. Not a local problem, not a regional problem, but a national problem. Because taxation revenue is basically a monopoly which the federal government holds. And it's held that monopoly since World War II, when constitutional changes allowed the federal government to take over taxation to satisfy or try to address the needs of the population as a whole. When you look at Australian history post-Federation, it's a history of continuous struggle by people who find themselves in a situation where they can't meet their daily needs. Every decade of the 20th century and every decade in the 2 decades of the 21st century highlight that issue. So this is not some new issue. Now, obviously, things become clouded. In any society, things become clouded. And the greater the divisions which exist in society, the greater it is, the harder it is, I should say, to pinpoint the problem. Now, this country, as a people, we've been beset by 2 major issues. One is the violent dispossession of this country's First Nations people over 240 years ago, in an orgy of violence which has not even been acknowledged almost 2.5 centuries later. It's quite telling that we celebrate Australia Day, the day this nation was born, as the day when the British Empire set up a penal colony at Port Jackson, and that we still continue to celebrate Australia Day on the 26th of January, the day that dispossession began on a wide scale. The second problem we have is that we've always felt that we were a white outpost in a hostile environment. And the colonisation process between Federation 1970s was about maintaining a white Australia. Now, these policies, which were taken up by the trade union movement as well as successive governments and churches and other institutions, let's not forget, when the first federal parliament sat, the first policy it passed was the White Australia policy, and only one member of the federal parliament voted against the introduction of that particular policies. So this has created a history of division, a history of division based on race, a history which we continue to experience today. So in an era when we refuse to acknowledge how this process began and to refuse to acknowledge what actually happened, we continue to have difficulty in pinpointing the problem. We think the problem is the immigrant. Now let's not forget that after World War II and the Japanese bombing of North Australia, that government policy changed to a populate or perish policy, because governments understood that you couldn't have 5 million people protecting a continent without increased population growth. So this populate or perish policy, which has led to a change in the racial composition of this country, has brought problems that continue to divide us. And while we have political parties that are based on racial divisions in this country, the fact is that the more we fight amongst each other because of our religious beliefs, which was a common issue at the beginning of the 20th century, where the Catholic-Protestant divide was still a significant issue, or whether it's on race or language or culture, the fact is that we will get nowhere. We will get nowhere as a people in addressing issues, let alone pinpointing the basis of these issues that we face today. The fact is, it's not the colour of the foot on your neck that's important. What's important is the fact that you have a foot on your neck. It's not the fact that we can't create enough wealth to satisfy our physical needs as well as the physical needs of tens of millions of people outside this continent. We continue to face these issues, and we need to pinpoint the problem. And the problem is very simple: that parliamentary democracy, the system by which we elect our leaders, has been usurped by a small group of people, the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. The fact is that over 40% of the wealth in this country is controlled by 1% of the population, and 1% of the wealth of this country is held by 30% of the population. Extraordinary differences. And these differences have continued. And they've continued during the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation phase that the capitalist economy, a private investment for private profit economy, has evolved in this country. Now, many people will tell you that small business is the engine room of the Australian economy. The fact is that small business is a shrinking element of the Australian economy for a variety of reasons. And the main reason is that corporatisation and globalisation have decreased competition. Not increased competition, but decreased competition. That's why 90% of Australian small businesses close within 5 years of being formed. So the issue is wealth and power. Power is not exercised through Parliament. If power was exercised through Parliament, considering the last election victory of the Australian Labor Party and the Greens in the Senate, you would see legislation be put through Parliament which would ensure that the wealth that was created was redistributed to look after the needs of the people of this country. not the greed of a minuscule minority. But no, the legislative agenda will continue to be a narrow agenda about distributing the crumbs that are brushed off the corporate table. The greater the amount of local resistance, the greater the amount of crumbs that are brushed off the corporate table. Because ultimately, a democracy isn't rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. And that's the missing ingredient. Anybody who wants to can tell you what the problem is. That it's not productivity, it's not the creation of wealth, it's the redistribution of that wealth by the government of the day, a government that is so hamstrung by powerful forces in our society that it cannot bring itself to passing significant legislation. And all it does is, trim the fat. It doesn't distribute the fat, trims pieces off the fat for the majority of people. So we have pinpointed the problem, and the problem isn't wealth creation. The problem isn't immigration. The problem isn't our inability to resolve our issues with First Nations people. The problem isn't based on religion or race or nationality or nationalism. The problem is our own making. We have allowed, through our acquiescence and acceptance of the status quo, for these inequalities to continue to be a critical and essential part of our lives. Ultimately, the type of society you live in is dependent on how involved people are in the day-to-day processes, involved in the decision-making processes. And while we consider that all we need to do is cast a vote every 3 to 4 years to elect representatives who can promise us everything and deliver nothing, then we will continue to be faced with the problems that we as individuals and as communities and as a sovereign nation state fail. We are the people we've been waiting for. That's why I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests. Have a look at the website, PIBCI, PIBCI.net. Without people involved in both extra-parliamentary and parliamentary agitation for change, nothing will occur. Every positive human change that has occurred through the history has occurred because one person, and then 10, and then 100, and then 1,000, and then 100,000, and then 1,000,000 take up those issues. And you can never take up those issues unless you pinpoint the problem.